January 7th, 1945, 0800 hours. Kummersdorf Proving Ground, 40 kilometers south of Berlin. The temperature hovered at -12 degrees Celsius. Frost covered every surface in the artillery testing facility's main laboratory, a converted warehouse with broken windows and makeshift heating that barely functioned. 3 American 105mm artillery shells sat on a wooden examination table under harsh electric lights powered by a diesel generator. Hauptmann Dieter Osenberg stood before them, hands thrust deep in his coat pockets, breath forming clouds in the frozen air. At 42 years old, Osenberg was one of Germany's senior artillery engineers, a specialist in fuse design who had spent the last decade developing time delay and impact mechanisms for Wehrmacht ordnance. Behind him, 5 other engineers waited, 2 from Rheinmetall, 2 from Krupp, 1 from Telefunken's electronics division. They had been summoned on 24 hours' notice. The orders came directly from Oberkommando der Wehrmacht, with a classification level Osenberg had never seen before. The shells had been recovered from the Ardennes front 3 days earlier. American artillery positions had been overrun during the opening phase of what the Allies called the Battle of the Bulge. Among the captured equipment were several dozen unexploded shells, along with wooden crates marked with U.S. Army ordnance codes. Frontline reports accompanying the shells described something that artillery officers found impossible to believe. These rounds detonated in midair with perfect consistency, 20 to 30 meters above ground level, without any timing mechanism that ground crews could identify. No calculations required, no adjustments for temperature or altitude. The shells simply knew when to explode. The phenomenon had been observed since September 1944, when American forces began their push into Germany. German infantry called them Wundergeschosse, wonder shells. They made defensive positions and death traps. Foxholes offered no protection. Trenches became killing zones. The fragmentation pattern from airbursts was devastating. Shrapnel raining down at angles that conventional ground-burst shells could never achieve. Casualty rates in units targeted by these weapons were running 3 to 4 times higher than from standard artillery. Osenberg had read the preliminary field reports with deep skepticism. Proximity fuses had been theoretically possible for years, discussed in engineering journals before the war. The concept was simple enough: a miniature radio transmitter in the nose of the shell that would detect the approaching ground through reflected radio waves and trigger detonation at optimal altitude. But the engineering challenges were considered insurmountable. Such a device would need to be small enough to fit in a fuse cavity, rugged enough to survive firing forces exceeding 15,000 times gravity, reliable enough to function after being stored for months, and cheap enough to be expendable. German engineers had concluded it couldn't be done. Not with current technology. Perhaps not for another decade. Yet here were 3 shells that apparently did exactly that. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. Dr. Werner Hauptmann from Telefunken stepped forward, gesturing toward the shells. Hauptmann, with your permission, I would like to begin with external examination before we attempt disassembly. We need to document everything. If the Americans have solved the miniaturization problem, every detail matters. Osenberg nodded. He understood the stakes. This wasn't just about understanding a new weapon. It was about understanding the technological capacity of the enemy. The fuse itself would reveal the state of American electronics, manufacturing precision, material science, every aspect of industrial capability compressed into a single expendable component. The team spent the first 30 minutes simply observing. The shells were standard American 105mm high explosive rounds, roughly half a meter long, weighing about 15 kilograms. The fuse occupied the nose cavity, a cylindrical component about 8 centimeters long and 4 centimeters in diameter. It looked deceptively ordinary, similar to conventional mechanical impact fuses in overall appearance. But There were differences. Small ventilation holes near the base, a distinctive seam pattern suggesting a more complex internal structure. The metal casing appeared to be aluminum alloy, lighter than German fuse housings. Hauptmann photographed every angle with a Leica camera, using a measuring rule to provide scale. Each shell was weighed, measured, marked. One of the Krupp engineers, a man named Fischer, examined the driving band, the copper ring that engaged the rifling grooves when the shell was fired. The deformation patterns tell us something about firing conditions. This shell was definitely fired. The band shows consistent rifling marks. It experienced full acceleration forces, but failed to detonate. Probably a dud, which is fortunate for us. Osenberg considered this. A dud meant the internal mechanism might be damaged, but it also meant they could examine it without worrying about accidental detonation. The electrical components would be intact enough to reveal their design. We will proceed with disassembly. Dr. Hauptmann, you will lead. I want every step documented. Photographs, sketches, notes. We may only get one chance at this. Hauptmann had brought specialized tools, precision screwdrivers, calipers, magnifying lenses, a jeweler's vise. He secured the fuse in the vise and began removing the nose cap, working slowly, testing each component before applying force. The other engineers crowded around, watching intently. The generator hummed in. The background. Someone lit a cigarette, hands shaking slightly. Whether from cold or tension, Osenberg couldn't tell. The nose cap came free after 10 minutes of careful work, revealing the interior structure. Hauptmann stopped, set down his tools, stared. Osenberg leaned closer. What is it? Hauptmann's voice was quiet, almost reverential. It is exactly what the reports claimed, a complete radio proximity fuse, and it is far more sophisticated than anything I imagined possible. The interior of the fuse was packed with components arranged in a cylindrical layout. At the very top, a small propeller mechanism connected to a safety arming system. Below that, a battery assembly. Then, the radio frequency circuit, with a miniature vacuum tube at its heart, an antenna system integrated into the fuse body. Finally, the detonator circuit, connected to the main explosive charge. Every component was miniaturized beyond anything the German engineers had seen in production electronics. But it was the vacuum tube that captured everyone's attention. Hauptmann extracted it with tweezers, holding it up to the light. The tube was perhaps 3 centimeters long, no thicker than a pencil. Its glass envelope was reinforced with some kind of internal support structure. The electrodes were visible inside, mounted in a configuration that suggested multiple functions, both transmitter and receiver, in a single unit. Hauptmann turned it slowly, examining it from every angle. Gentlemen, this vacuum tube is approximately 1/8 the size of our smallest production tubes. Look at the electrode structure. The precision is extraordinary, and according to the rifling marks on this shell, this tube survived being fired from an artillery piece. Our tubes shatter if you drop them from waist height. Fischer, from Krupp, had been examining the battery assembly. He held up a small glass vial, now broken, with chemical residue visible. This is brilliant. The battery is inactive until firing. The glass vial contains the electrolyte. When the shell is fired, the acceleration forces shatter the vial, the electrolyte floods the battery cells, and power becomes available. Indefinite shelf life. No degradation during storage. We have discussed this concept, but I have never seen it implemented with such elegance. Osenberg understood immediately what he was seeing. This was not a prototype, not an experimental system rushed into field testing. This was mature technology, refined through multiple design iterations, produced at scale. The manufacturing precision, the integration of components, the elegant solutions to complex problems, all indicated years of development work. How many of these have the Americans produced? He asked. No one answered immediately. Finally, Hauptmann spoke. Based on the frontline reports since September, tens of thousands at minimum. Possibly hundreds of thousands. They are using them as standard artillery ammunition, not as special weapons for critical targets. The implications settled over the group like a physical weight. To produce these fuses at that scale required an electronics manufacturing infrastructure far beyond German capabilities. It required vacuum tube factories operating with extraordinary quality control, chemical plants producing high-purity materials, precision machining facilities, all operating without interruption, without bombing raids destroying production, without raw material shortages. Osenberg had spent the war years watching German weapons production struggle with mounting difficulties, factories destroyed by Allied bombing, skilled workers conscripted to frontline service, raw materials in chronic shortage, quality control deteriorating as production pressure increased. Every German weapons program faced the same constraints: do more with less, make it simpler, accept lower quality, because perfect is impossible. The Americans apparently faced no such constraints. Over the next 2 hours, the team systematically disassembled all 3 fuses. They sketched diagrams, measured components, analyzed materials. Every fuse was essentially identical, confirming mass production rather than hand-built prototypes. The standardization was itself remarkable. German fuses showed variation between manufacturers, sometimes between production batches from the same factory. These American fuses were interchangeable down to the millimeter. Hauptmann focused on the radio frequency circuit, tracing the electrical pathways, identifying components. The circuit design is sophisticated but not unnecessarily complex. They have optimized for reliability and manufacturability. Look here, the antenna is integrated into the fuse body itself. No external components to be damaged during handling. And this tuning capacitor, it is preset at the factory. No field adjustments required. The infantryman just screws the fuse onto the shell, and it works. One of the Rheinmetall engineers, Becker, examined the safety and arming mechanism. The propeller at the nose spins in the airstream after the shell is fired. After a set number of rotations, approximately 3 to 5 seconds of flight time, it mechanically arms the detonator circuit. Before that point, the fuse cannot function. Elegant, fail-safe design. Protects the gun crew if there is a bore. Premature. Osenberg made notes, filling page after page in his engineering notebook. But his mind was working beyond the technical details toward larger questions. How had American electronics capability advanced to this level? Germany had been the world leader in precision engineering, in scientific research, in advanced technology development. That had been the foundation of early Wehrmacht successes. German tanks better than French or Soviet designs, German aircraft superior to Polish or British equivalents, German artillery more accurate, more powerful. When had that changed? When had America, a nation Germany's leadership had dismissed as weak and industrial, rather than military, developed such overwhelming technological advantages? By 1100 hours, the initial examination was complete. The team had documented every component of all 3 fuses. Hauptmann had compiled a preliminary technical report, handwritten but detailed. Osenberg gathered everyone around the examination table for assessment. Dr. Hauptmann, your evaluation. Can Germany produce a similar fuse? Hauptmann chose his words carefully. Hauptmann, we can understand the principles. The radio frequency design is clever, but not beyond German engineering capability. We could design a comparable system, given time and resources. But manufacturing? He shook his head. No, not at present. Perhaps not for years. Explain. The vacuum tube is the critical component. To survive the firing shock, it requires manufacturing precision we do not currently achieve in production. Our tube factories are optimized for larger, more robust designs. Retooling for this level of miniaturization would require months, perhaps a year, and that assumes uninterrupted production, which we cannot guarantee given Allied bombing. What about the other components? Osenberg pressed. The battery chemistry appears to be standard, but the glass vial precision is extraordinary. The fuse body machining is excellent. The assembly requires clean facilities and skilled workers. Hauptmann paused. Every component represents manufacturing capability, not revolutionary technology, but systematic industrial sophistication. The Americans are not making these in laboratory workshops. They are mass-producing them with the kind of quality control we associate with precision instruments. but at the scale of automobile production. Fisher added, even if we had the designs today, even if we somehow acquired all the manufacturing knowledge, we lack the industrial base to produce them in meaningful numbers. Our electronics factories are operating at perhaps 40% of peak capacity due to bombing damage and material shortages. American factories are apparently operating without such constraints. Becker, from Rheinmetall, raised another point. There is also the question of resources. Each fuse contains approximately 40 grams of copper in the windings, 10 grams of silver in the contacts, specialized chemicals in the battery. Multiply that by 100,000 fuses, by 1 million. The material requirements are enormous. The Americans are expending these resources on ammunition that detonates once and is destroyed. They have such abundance that they can afford to be wasteful by our standards. Osenberg understood the message his team was conveying, though no one wanted to state it explicitly. This fuse represented not just a technological gap, but an industrial reality gap. Germany was fighting a war of scarcity, where every gram of copper mattered, where vacuum tubes were carefully rationed. America was fighting a war of abundance, where sophisticated electronics could be installed in artillery, shells, and blown apart after a single use. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The afternoon session focused on comparative analysis. Osenberg had brought technical manuals for German artillery fuses, the standard Zeitzunder time delay systems and Aufschlagzunder impact systems. They laid out German fuse components next to American ones. The contrast was stark. German mechanical time fuse used clockwork mechanisms, springs and gears to trigger detonation after a preset delay. They were reliable when properly set, but required calculations based on range, angle, and atmospheric conditions. An artillery officer needed training and experience to select the correct timing in combat conditions under fire with incomplete information. Errors were common. Shells might detonate too high, wasting the fragmentation effect, or too low, burying themselves before detonation, or, not at all, becoming duds. The American proximity fuse eliminated all that complexity. No calculations, no settings, just screw it onto the shell and fire. The fuse itself sensed the ground and detonated at optimal altitude every time. It was brilliant in its simplicity from the user's perspective, though hideously complex internally. Hauptmann performed calculations on a chalkboard. Based on the circuit design and published radio frequency theory, I estimate this fuse operates at approximately 180 megahertz. The transmitter power is low, perhaps half a watt. The receiver is extremely sensitive. When the shell descends toward ground, the reflected signal strength increases. When it reaches a threshold corresponding to approximately 20 to 30 meters altitude, the trigger circuit fires the detonator. How accurate is the altitude sensing? Osenberg asked. Hauptmann considered. Given the radio frequency wavelength and circuit design, probably plus or minus 5 meters, more than adequate for anti-personnel fragmentation. The Americans have optimized for a specific tactical purpose, airburst artillery against infantry and light vehicles, and achieved it with remarkable effectiveness. Fisher had been studying American industrial statistics from intelligence reports compiled before the war. He produced a folder of documents, pre-war trade publications showing American electronics manufacturing capacity. Gentlemen, before the war, the United States had the largest civilian electronics industry in the world. RCI alone was producing millions of radio receivers annually. Western Electric, General Electric, Westinghouse, all enormous manufacturing operations. When war began, they converted that capacity to military production. He laid out charts showing production figures. In 1940, American radio production was approximately 10 million units. Germany produced perhaps 1 million. The American electronics industry was simply an order of magnitude, larger than ours, with more automation, more standardization, more efficient manufacturing processes. When they applied that capacity to military electronics, the results were predictable. Osenberg studied the charts. The numbers were sobering. Before the war, Germany's leadership had dismissed American industrial might as irrelevant to military power. Mass production was for consumer goods, for automobiles and refrigerators, not for advanced weapons. Quality German engineering would overcome American quantity. Except the Americans had proven capable of producing both quality and quantity simultaneously. By 1400 hours, Osenberg began drafting his preliminary report for Oberkommando der Wehrmacht. He wrote carefully, knowing his conclusions would be read by officers who preferred optimism to accuracy. But he was a scientist and engineer first. His obligation was to truth, however unwelcome. Germany should immediately prioritize electronics manufacturing modernization, though given current resource constraints and Allied bombing campaigns, closing the gap may not be achievable within any operationally relevant time frame. He read through what he had written. It was careful, technical, and understated. But the conclusion was clear enough. Germany was fighting an enemy whose technological and industrial capabilities had been severely underestimated. This little fuse, weighing less than half a kilogram, proved it beyond any doubt. Hauptmann approached with additional notes. Hauptmann, I have been calculating production requirements. If the Americans have been using these fuses since September, and if they are firing them at the rate indicated by frontline reports, they must be producing at least 20,000 fuses per week, possibly much more. That implies factory infrastructure we cannot begin to match. 20,000 per week. Osenberg did mathematics. Mentally, over 1 million per year, each containing a precision vacuum tube, a complex circuit, a miniature battery, all assembled to exacting standards. It was staggering. Germany's entire electronics industry, operating at peak capacity before the bombing campaigns, could perhaps have produced similar numbers, but peak capacity was a distant memory. Current production was a fraction of that, and declining monthly. By 1600 hours, as winter darkness fell outside and the temperature in the warehouse dropped further, Osenberg called a final meeting. The engineers gathered around the examination table one last time, looking at the disassembled fuses, the components laid out in precise rows, the vacuum tube sitting in a small wooden holder under the electric light. Gentlemen, your work today has been exemplary. The documentation you have produced will be invaluable. But before we conclude, I want to hear your frank assessment, not what you would write in an official report, but what you actually believe. This fuse, what does it tell us about the outcome of the war? Silence. The men looked at each other, reluctant to speak. Finally, Hauptmann responded. Hauptmann, as an electronics engineer, I can tell you that this device represents a level of manufacturing sophistication that takes years to develop. It is not something the Americans invented last year. They have been working on this technology since at least 1941 or 42, perhaps earlier. They have solved complex problems, refined designs, optimized manufacturing. This is mature technology. He gestured at the components. If they are this far ahead in artillery fuses, they are probably ahead in many other areas we have not yet discovered. Radar, certainly. Radio communications. Perhaps other systems we have not even considered. The technological advantage is systematic, not isolated. And, Osenberg prompted, Hauptmann met his eyes, and technological advantages of this magnitude are decisive in industrial warfare. Individual German soldier quality or tactical excellence cannot compensate. Mathematics is against us. Fischer added, even if the war situation somehow stabilized, even if we achieved a stalemate on the ground, we cannot close this industrial gap. Our electronics manufacturing base is being destroyed faster than we can rebuild it. The Americans face no such constraint. The gap is widening, not narrowing. Becker spoke last. I served on the Eastern Front before being assigned to ordnance development. I saw what Soviet numerical superiority meant, how endless waves of T-34s overwhelmed tactically superior German forces. This is similar but worse. Not just numerical superiority, but technological superiority combined with numerical superiority. There is no tactical solution. Osenberg nodded slowly. He had reached the same conclusions, but wanted to hear them from independent voices to confirm he was not simply being defeatist. What they were describing was military reality, cold and unforgiving as the January air. He gathered his notes, his technical drawings, and the photographs Hauptmann had taken. The evidence was comprehensive. The conclusion was unavoidable. The proximity fuse was a message and a communication from American industry to German command. The message was simple: you cannot win. Whether German leadership would accept that message was another question entirely. They secured the fuse components in wooden crates, labeled and documented. Osenberg sealed his report in an envelope marked Geheime Kommandosache, secret command matter, the highest classification. It would go by courier to Berlin the next morning, to Wehrmacht, High Command, where officers would read it, assess it, and decide what to do with information they almost certainly did not want to hear. As the engineers prepared to leave, Hauptmann approached Osenberg privately. "Hauptmann, may I speak frankly? Of course, your report is excellent, thorough, and accurate. It will be ignored." Osenberg probably agreed. The leadership cannot accept what this fuse proves. Accepting American or technological superiority requires accepting that our fundamental assumptions were wrong, that German engineering is not inherently superior, that industrial capacity matters more than individual excellence. These admissions are psychologically impossible for people who have built their identities around German superiority. "So we write accurate reports that are filed away and forgotten," Osenberg said bitterly. "Not entirely forgotten," Hauptmann replied. "Copies circulate. Technical specialists read them. Frontline commanders who face these weapons want accurate information. The truth spreads, even if the official command ignores it, and after the war, if there is an after, the documentation will exist. Future historians will know that some German engineers understood reality, even if leadership did not." Osenberg appreciated the thought, though it was cold comfort. He shook Hartmann's hand. "Thank you, Doctor. Your expertise was invaluable today." After everyone had left, Osenberg remained alone in the darkened warehouse with the disassembled fuses. He picked up the tiny vacuum tube, barely visible in the weak light from the single remaining bulb. Such a small thing, a few grams of glass and metal. Yet it represented something enormous, the full weight of American industrial might compressed into a component small enough to fit inside an artillery shell. He thought about the German soldiers in frozen foxholes on the Western Front, hearing the whistle of incoming shells, knowing those shells would explode overhead with perfect precision, knowing there was no protection, no defense. He thought about the Wehrmacht officers planning counterattacks, calculating force ratios and tactical advantages, not knowing that the enemy possessed systematic technological superiority across multiple domains. He thought about Hitler and the OKW staff in Berlin, still speaking of wonder weapons and final victory, detached from physical reality. This fuse told a different story. It told of a war already decided, of an enemy so far ahead in the industrial and technological race that defeat was not a possibility, but an inevitability. 6 hours of examination had revealed what years of combat should have made obvious. Germany was not losing because of insufficient willpower or strategic errors. Germany was losing because it was fighting an opponent with overwhelming material and technological advantages. Osenberg carefully placed the vacuum tube back in its holder. Tomorrow, his report would begin its journey through the bureaucratic maze of Wehrmacht command. It would be read, summarized, probably classified, and filed. The war would continue. Soldiers would die. Cities would burn. And in the end, reality would assert itself, as reality always does, indifferent to ideology or preference. He turned off the laboratory lights, locked the warehouse, and walked out into the winter darkness. Above, the sky was clear and cold, stars visible despite the distant glow of fires from Berlin. Somewhere to the west, American factories were running second shift, producing proximity fuses by the thousands, vacuum tubes by the millions, all the sophisticated electronics of modern warfare in quantities Germany could not imagine. let alone match. The war was already lost. It had been lost in the factories of Detroit and the laboratories of New Jersey, lost in the decision to fight an enemy whose industrial capacity was 10 times larger, lost in the years of self-deception and propaganda that claimed quality would triumph over quantity. A proximity fuse weighing 200 grams had proven all of it. 6 hours of careful examination had revealed the truth. What remained was whether anyone with authority would accept it and whether it mattered anymore. The generator shut down behind him. The laboratory fell silent, and the war, indifferent to what Hauptmann Dieter Osenberg had discovered, continued. Osenberg's report reached Wehrmacht High Command on January 9th. It was delivered by motorcycle courier, arriving at the Maybach complex in Zossen, 30 kilometers south of Berlin, where OKW maintained its operations center in reinforced bunkers designed to survive bombing raids. The report went first to Oberst Heinrich Müller, Chief of Artillery Technical Intelligence. Müller was a career officer, 53 years old, who had risen through the ranks during the interwar years when the Wehrmacht was rebuilding from Versailles treaty limitations. He read Osenberg's report over breakfast in his office, a concrete room lit by electric bulbs, the walls lined with filing cabinets containing thousands of intelligence assessments. Müller read it twice. The first time, he absorbed the technical details, the component descriptions, the circuit analysis. The second time, he focused on Osenberg's conclusions, particularly the strategic assessment section. When he finished, he sat for several minutes, staring at the photographs of the miniature vacuum tube. He had seen similar reports before. The analysis of the captured American SCR-584 radar in 1943, which revealed automatic tracking capabilities German systems lacked, and the evaluation of the Soviet T-34 tank in 1941, which showed that Russian industrial design was more sophisticated than German intelligence had believed. The assessment of British centimetric radar in 1942, proof that the Allies had surpassed German electronics in critical areas. Each report had reached the same implicit conclusion. German technological superiority was a myth. The Wehrmacht was fighting enemies who possessed equal or superior technology in multiple domains, combined with greater industrial capacity. Each report had been noted, filed, and largely ignored at strategic level. Operational commanders adapted tactics, but strategic doctrine remained unchanged. The war would be won through willpower, through the superiority of German training and fighting spirit, through tactical excellence. Müller drafted a cover memo for his superior, General Major Walter Warlimont, Deputy Chief of OKW Operations Staff. He wrote carefully, knowing that Warlimont would forward the report to General Oberst Alfred Jodl, and Jodl might bring it to Hitler's attention. He marked the package for Warlimont's attention and sent it up the chain. At General Major Warlimont's level, the report arrived along with dozens of other intelligence assessments, operational summaries, and logistical reports. Warlimont, overwhelmed by the collapsing situation on both Eastern and Western fronts, assigned a junior staff officer to summarize key points. The summary that reached Warlimont's desk was 3 paragraphs, reducing Osenberg's 12 pages to a brief notation. Americans deploying new artillery fuse with proximity detonation capability, mass-produced, increases effectiveness of artillery bombardment. No immediate countermeasure available. The strategic assessment section, Osenberg's careful analysis of American industrial superiority, was omitted from the summary as technical detail not operationally relevant. Warlimont read the summary, made a notation that artillery commanders should be informed, and moved on to more pressing matters. The report was filed in the General Intelligence Archives. It did not reach Jodl. It certainly did not reach Hitler, but copies circulated through unofficial channels. Technical specialists at Wehrmacht Proving Grounds passed it among colleagues. Artillery officers who heard about the report requested copies through back channels. By late January, Osenberg's analysis was being read by engineers and frontline commanders across the Wehrmacht. Even as OKW ignored its strategic implications, Hauptmann Franz Müller commanded a battery of 105mm howitzers with the 7th Army in the Saar region. He received a copy of Osenberg's report in mid-January, passed to him by a friend at the artillery school in Jüterbog. Müller read it in his command bunker by candlelight while American artillery pounded German positions 3 kilometers away. He recognized immediately what Osenberg was describing. His infantry had been reporting airbursts for weeks, shells that detonated overhead with uncanny precision, turning every defensive position into a killing zone. Casualty rates had tripled. Morale was collapsing. Men refused to leave bunkers, even when ordered to counterattack, knowing that American artillery would catch them in the open with those impossible shells. Müller understood something that OKW staff officers in their comfortable bunkers did not. The proximity fuse wasn't just a technical curiosity, it was a tactical revolution. It negated every defensive doctrine German artillery had developed over 30 years. Dispersion, concealment, fortification, all meaningless when shells detonated in the air above you. He forwarded the report to his divisional commander with a note. This analysis explains the casualty rates we have been experiencing. American artillery effectiveness has increased by a factor of 3 to 4. Current defensive positions are inadequate. Recommend deep bunkers with overhead protection or withdrawal to less exposed positions. His divisional commander acknowledged the report and did nothing. There were no resources for deeper bunkers. Withdrawal was forbidden by direct order from Army Group headquarters. The positions would be held regardless of casualties. That was the order. That was always the order. In Berlin, a different kind of analysis was taking place. Dr. Ernst Steinhoff, a physicist working at Peenemünde on rocket development, obtained Osenberg's report through a colleague at Kummersdorf. Steinhoff had been involved in German proximity fuse research in 1942 and 43, before the program was cancelled due to resource limitations. He read Osenberg's technical description of the American fuse and immediately recognized several design elements his team had considered but rejected as too difficult to manufacture. The Americans had apparently solved every problem that had stymied German development: vacuum tube, ruggedization, circuit miniaturization, battery activation, production quality control. Steinhoff wrote his own analysis, expanding on Osenberg's conclusions. He compared the American proximity fuse to German weapons programs, particularly the V-2 rocket. The comparison was unflattering to German priorities. The V-2 was a technological marvel, the world's first long-range ballistic missile, but each missile required thousands of man-hours to build, used scarce resources, carried a 1-ton warhead no more destructive than a conventional bomb, and had a circular error of several kilometers. The strategic impact was minimal. The WWII program consumed enormous resources for negligible military effect. The proximity fuse, by contrast, was simple, mass-produced, and devastatingly effective. It didn't require revolutionary technology, just systematic engineering and quality manufacturing. Yet its tactical impact was far greater than the V-2s. American artillery equipped with proximity fuses was destroying German defensive positions all along the Western Front, killing thousands, disrupting operations, crushing morale. Steinhoff's analysis concluded, "We pursued prestige technology, weapons that demonstrated German scientific brilliance, but had limited military value. The Americans pursued practical technology, weapons that could be mass-produced and deployed at scale. They chose correctly. We did not." His report, like Osenberg's, circulated among technical specialists and was ignored by Strategic Command. By February 1945, the military situation had deteriorated catastrophically. The Ardennes offensive had failed. Soviet forces were advancing into eastern Germany. American and British forces were approaching the Rhine. German industrial production was collapsing under relentless Allied bombing. Fuel shortages grounded the Luftwaffe. Ammunition was rationed. Replacement soldiers were 16-year-old boys and 50-year-old men, barely trained, thrown into combat against veteran Allied forces. In this context, a report about American artillery fuses seemed almost irrelevant. What did it matter if the Americans had superior electronics when they also had superior numbers, superior logistics, superior air power, superior everything? The war was lost. Everyone knew it, except the leadership in Berlin. Osenberg, still at Kummersdorf, received orders in late February to prepare a presentation for the Reich Research Council, a civilian organization that coordinated scientific research. The Council wanted a comprehensive assessment of Allied weapons technology based on captured equipment. Osenberg was assigned the electronics section. He worked for 2 weeks, compiling data from multiple sources. The proximity fuse analysis, captured radar systems, recovered radio equipment, examination of American aircraft electronics. Every data point told the same story. American electronics technology was systematically superior, more miniaturized, more reliable, more producible at scale. The presentation took place on March 8th in a Berlin ministry building that had survived the bombing, though nearby structures were rubble. 30 scientists and engineers attended, along with several ministry officials and a general major from OKW that Osenberg didn't recognize. Osenberg presented for 40 minutes, methodically documenting the evidence. He showed photographs of the proximity fuse components. He displayed comparison charts of German versus American radar specifications. He presented production estimates, casualty statistics, tactical assessments. His conclusion was stark. Allied electronics technology, particularly American, has surpassed German capabilities across multiple domains. The gap is approximately 5 to 7 years in design sophistication and possibly a full decade in manufacturing capacity. Given the destruction of German industrial infrastructure and the uninterrupted operation of Allied factories, this gap is widening. Current German weapons development operates under constraints that make competitive technology impossible within any operationally relevant time frame. The room was silent when he finished. Then the questions began. A scientist from Siemens challenged the timeline. 5 to 7 years seems excessive. Surely with focused effort we could close the gap more quickly. Osenberg responded carefully. In peacetime, with unlimited resources, perhaps, but we are not in peacetime. Our factories are being bombed, skilled workers are scarce, raw materials are rationed. The Americans face none of these constraints. While we struggle to maintain production of existing designs, they are iterating and improving. The gap grows wider, not narrower. The General Major spoke, voice edged with irritation. Dr. Osenberg, you seem to be suggesting that German science is inferior to American science. I find this difficult to accept, given our achievements. The jet aircraft, the rocket, the advanced submarine designs. I am not suggesting German science is inferior, Osenberg replied evenly. German scientists and engineers are among the world's finest, but individual excellence cannot overcome systematic industrial disadvantages. The Americans have larger factories, more automation, better supply chains, and uninterrupted production. They can afford to mass-produce sophisticated technology. We cannot. Are you saying the war is lost due to industrial factors? The General Major's tone was dangerous now. Defeatism was a capital offense. Osenberg chose his words with extreme care. I am saying that technological competition requires industrial capacity. Wars are won by many factors: tactics, strategy, morale, leadership. But in industrial warfare, the side with greater production capacity and technological sophistication possesses significant advantages. My analysis documents those advantages as they exist in the electronics domain. The General Major stared at him for a long moment, then made a notation and said nothing further. After the presentation, several scientists approached Osenberg privately. They thanked him for his honesty. They shared their own observations of Allied technological superiority in various fields: optics, metallurgy, synthetic materials. The pattern repeated across domains. German quality remained high in many areas, but Allied, particularly American, production scale was overwhelming. One elderly physicist, Professor Dr. Werner Heisenberg, pulled Osenberg aside. Your analysis is accurate and brave, but understand that accuracy and bravery will not protect you if the wrong people decide you're undermining morale. Be careful. Osenberg thanked him for the warning, but he was past caring about personal safety. What mattered was documenting reality, ensuring that someone, somewhere, understood what had actually happened, why Germany had lost the technological war long before losing the military one. In April 1945, as Soviet artillery shelled Berlin and American forces crossed the Elbe, Osenberg received orders to destroy all sensitive documents and evacuate Kummersdorf. He disobeyed the first order. Instead of burning his files, he secured them in a waterproof container and buried them near the facility, marking the location carefully. The documents included his proximity fuse analysis, his presentation materials, correspondence with other scientists, technical reports on dozens of Allied weapons systems. After the war, he would retrieve them. Future historians would need them to understand what had happened, how Germany's technological position had been systematically misunderstood by leadership that believed its own propaganda. He evacuated west ahead of Soviet forces, eventually surrendering to American troops in Bavaria. During his interrogation by U.S. technical intelligence officers, he was asked specifically about the proximity fuse analysis. "Dr. Osenberg, we recovered a copy of your January report from Wehrmacht files. Your technical analysis was remarkably accurate. Every conclusion you reached was correct. Did the German command act on your findings?" Osenberg laughed bitterly. "My report was noted and filed. The strategic implications were ignored because they contradicted the narrative of German superiority. The senior command preferred comforting lies to uncomfortable truths." If German leadership had accepted your assessment, would it have changed anything? By January 1945, no. The war was already decided. But if such assessments had been accepted in 1941 or 42, when accurate intelligence might have influenced strategic decisions? He shook his head. That's a different question. Perhaps it would have mattered. Perhaps not, but at minimum Germany would have fought with a realistic understanding of the enemy's capabilities rather than comfortable delusions. The American officer made notes. "Our records show we produced approximately 22 million proximity fuses during the war. Does that match your production estimates?" Osenberg did a quick mental calculation. "I estimated tens of thousands per week based on frontline deployment rates. Over 3 years, that would be several million at minimum. 22 million exceeds my estimate significantly, but does not surprise me. Your industrial capacity was systematically underestimated by German intelligence. Why do you think that was?" "Ideology," Osenberg said simply. "German leadership believed in inherent superiority, racial, cultural, technological. Accepting that Americans or Soviets could match or exceed German capabilities would require abandoning fundamental ideological commitments. Most preferred to maintain the ideology and ignore contradicting evidence." In 1946, Osenberg was recruited under Operation Paperclip to work for U.S. Army Ordnance. He spent the next decade at Aberdeen Proving Ground in Maryland, evaluating artillery systems and training American officers on German weapons technology. The irony was not lost on him. He had spent the war documenting American superiority. Now he worked for the Americans, helping them understand why they had won. In a 1952 interview with a military historian, Osenberg reflected on the proximity fuse analysis. That examination in January 1945 was 6 hours that revealed the entire war in miniature. Every German weakness was there. Inadequate industrial capacity, bombing, disrupted production, resource shortages, ideological blindness to enemy capabilities, and every American strength, massive industrial base, technological sophistication, quality manufacturing at scale, systematic engineering approach. He continued, the fuse itself was not revolutionary technology. Radio proximity detection was theoretically understood, but converting theory to mass-produced hardware requires industrial infrastructure, precision manufacturing, quality control systems, uninterrupted production, and abundant materials. The Americans had all of that. We had none of it by 1945, and very little of it even at our peak. What should German leadership have learned from your report? The historian asked. That technological competition is decided by industrial systems, not individual genius. That quantity has a quality all its own when combined with acceptable technical standards. That propaganda about superiority is dangerous when it prevents accurate assessment of reality. Osenberg paused. But the most important lesson, which applies beyond this specific war, is that wars are won by the side that understands reality correctly and adapts accordingly. Germany fought a war based on ideology and wishful thinking. America fought a war based on industrial calculation and systematic problem-solving. The outcome was inevitable. In 1958, the proximity fuse was declassified, and detailed technical information became publicly available. Osenberg read the official development history with fascination. The program had begun in 1940, a full year before Pearl Harbor, as a British initiative. American engineers at the National Bureau of Standards and Johns Hopkins Applied Physics Laboratory had solved the miniaturization and ruggedization problems by 1942. Mass production began in 1943. By 1944, when Osenberg first encountered frontline reports, the Americans had already produced millions. The development timeline proved his wartime assessment correct. The Americans hadn't gotten lucky. They had pursued systematic development over years, solving problems methodically, refining designs, optimizing production. By the time Germany encountered the weapon, it was mature technology deployed at massive scale. Osenberg published his own account in 1961, a technical paper in the Journal of Applied Physics comparing German and American artillery fuse development. The paper was rigorous and devastating. It documented how German programs were starved of resources, disrupted by bombing, constrained by material shortages, while American programs operated with generous funding, uninterrupted production, and continuous improvement. His conclusion: in technological competition, the side that can sustain systematic development and mass production will prevail over the side that pursues individual innovations without supporting infrastructure. The proximity fuse demonstrated this principle with exceptional clarity. In 1978, near the end of his career, Osenberg returned to Germany for a conference on World War II technology. He visited Kummersdorf, now in East Germany, and retrieved his buried documents. They had survived, protected by the waterproof container. He donated them to the Bundesarchive, ensuring future historians would have primary source documentation. During that visit, he was interviewed by a German television crew producing a documentary on wartime weapons. They asked him what the proximity fuse had meant. "It meant the war was already lost when we examined it," he said simply. Not because of that specific weapon, but because of what it revealed about relative industrial capabilities. A single artillery fuse, properly analyzed, demonstrated systematic American superiority across electronics manufacturing. If they were that far ahead in one domain, they were likely ahead in many others. And indeed they were. Radar, radio, fire control systems, countless applications we never fully understood during the war. Do you think German leadership should have surrendered earlier once the technological disparity was clear? Osenberg considered carefully. "I am an engineer, not a politician or moral philosopher. From a purely technical standpoint, once the industrial and technological balance was clear, probably by 1943 at latest, the military outcome was determined. Continued fighting could not change the result, only increase casualties. But whether early surrender was politically or morally correct is beyond my expertise. What lesson should modern nations learn from this? Accurate assessment of relative capabilities is essential. Propaganda and ideology cannot change physical reality. If you deceive yourself about your position relative to adversaries, you will make catastrophically wrong decisions. Germany's leadership believed its own propaganda about superiority and made strategic choices based on that false belief. The results speak for themselves." Osenberg passed away in 1983 at age 80. His obituary in the New York Times described him as an artillery engineer who provided some of the clearest-eyed assessments of American technological superiority during World War II, analyses that German command largely ignored. His January 1945 report on the proximity fuse remained his most significant contribution, not because it revealed unknown information. Allied superiority was becoming obvious to anyone willing to see, but because it documented that reality with scientific precision at a time when German leadership preferred comfortable delusion. The proximity fuse itself became recognized as one of the most important weapons innovations of World War II. General George Patton called it one of the three most critical developments, alongside the atomic bomb and radar. British operational analysis concluded it increased artillery effectiveness by 200 to 300%. Post-war studies estimated it saved thousands of Allied lives by reducing the ammunition expenditure required to neutralize enemy positions. But from Osenberg's perspective, the fuse's greatest significance was as a diagnostic tool. A single data point that, properly analyzed, revealed the true state of technological competition. 200 grams of electronics, examined carefully for 6 hours, proved what years of combat should have demonstrated. Industrial capacity combined with technological sophistication was decisive. Individual genius, tactical excellence, and fighting spirit could not overcome systematic disadvantages in production and technology. The lesson remained relevant decades later. In technological competition, whether military or civilian, accurate assessment of relative capabilities matters more than ideology or wishful thinking. The side that understands reality correctly and adapts accordingly will prevail over the side living in comfortable illusion. Germany in 1945 had chosen illusion. American proximity fuses, detonating overhead with perfect precision thousands of times daily, were reality's response. The shells that knew when to explode carried an undeniable message about industrial might and technological sophistication. Hauptmann Dieter Osenberg understood that message after 6 hours of careful examination. German leadership refused to read it until Soviet artillery was shelling the Reich Chancellery. In the end, reality asserted itself, as it always does, indifferent to ideology, propaganda, or preference. The proximity fuse was not just a weapon. It was a messenger, and the message was clear to anyone willing to listen. The war was already lost, not on battlefields, but in factories. In the systematic industrial competition, Germany could not win. 6 hours of examination, one accurate report, a truth documented and ignored. By the time German command acknowledged reality, hundreds of thousands more had died, cities had burned, and the final outcome had long since been determined. The shells knew when to explode. German leadership never learned when to stop. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.